Hi, welcome back to The Intersect. I'm your host, Cory. On today's episode, which is launching ahead of the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, I wanted to share how this national tragedy became a defining moment for me as a journalist, shaping how I understand technology, content, and community. 20 years ago, I had a young family and I was working as the managing editor of NOLA.com. This was the beginning of my journalism career, and it was also the beginning of the digital journalism era. When Katrina first hit, most of the staff was evacuated, and we thought we'd dodged a bullet. But just after landfall, my editor started messaging me. He would soon evacuate himself in the back of a newspaper delivery truck with the rest of the staff of the paper that was still in the city. His words to me were, "Cory, think body bags, thousands and thousands of body bags." I had evacuated to Baton Rouge with my then partner and my kids. Our newsroom set up shop at LSU's Manship School of Journalism. We were unable to print the paper because, well, the printing press was literally underwater, and then everything instantly went online. NOLA.com became a destination for the displaced and the missing. Before the storm hit and the city started filling up with water, we put up a blog asking people to share their evacuation stories. We published messages from people trapped in their attics with rising water levels. Friends and relatives sent their locations to our blog, praying someone would see them. I personally will never forget watching CNN when a Coast Guard rescuer was holding up a printout of our blog, and he said, "We are using this to find people." At that moment, I knew my life's work would be about connection, community, and content. And that's what I wanted to explore in this episode. So I came back to New Orleans to meet with the very people doing this work. Michelle Payne is a Chief Strategy and Resiliency Officer at the United Way of Southeast Louisiana, and Kirby Nagel is a Public Information Officer. Both women lived through Katrina in different ways. Michelle is a college student, and Kirby is a high schooler in Arkansas whose school absorbed displaced students. Today, their careers are dedicated to building the kinds of tools we only dreamt of back then. Real-time flood alerts, community networks, ways to get information into people's hands when they need it the most. And while this episode is rooted in Katrina, it's a reminder that this isn't just a New Orleans story. It's a story for all of us. As we're living in a world reshaped by climate change, survival depends on how we prepare, how we connect, and how we take care of each other. And tech is undeniably a huge part of that. Let's get into it. Michelle Payne, Kirby Nagel, welcome to The Intersect.
How you doing?
I am really delighted to be sitting with both of you ladies today. Thank you both for taking the time. It's a very busy week for the two of you. You're preparing for K20, which colloquially it's been called the 20th anniversary of Katrina. Whoa.
Yeah.
You were both involved at the time and a couple of different ways. And then now you're both working on the front lines. You've been working on this rebuild and you're applying these new modern ways to deal with emergency response, disaster response. What's going through your minds as you're getting ready for this big anniversary?
Thanks so much for having us. This has been a really eye-opening experience just from a reflection standpoint for us. So I was actually a senior at Loyola University here in New Orleans when Katrina hit. Everyone lost something and everyone experienced different, memories and loss during this time. And unfortunately, everything changed in a moment's notice. 20 years later, I'm now in fundraising and try to figure out how to mobilize networks and bring in funds when people, are at their lowest, and how can we help them in terms of just providing them with anything.
Kirby,
Yeah.
tell us.
So I was a high school senior. I'm sorry, Michelle. I hate to do that to you. I was a high school senior in Arkansas. So growing up in Tornado Alley, I've seen a lot of disaster and a lot of destruction. Certainly didn't have a grasp of what a hurricane meant and what it felt like to track it. But it was kind of a couple of weekends back to back where Katrina came through, the remnants, and then Hurricane Rita came through. But then shortly thereafter, the families moved into our community.
The Katrina
into
families.
Central Arkansas, Katrina and some folks from Rita as well. And certainly there was, much larger swaths of folks moving into the Gulf Coast, into Houston, and sort of got an early understanding of what community building is like and how to offer a sense of home for those folks. I can only imagine how shocking and jarring it was to move into the center of the Bible Belt, into a dry county with right? It's a very different place.
It's a different culture.
It's a different culture.
Totally moving to a different culture.
Some 10 years later, moving into New Orleans and hearing from people who have become like our second family, what really happened in the Dome, what really happened around those areas, opened my eyes into what's happened. And now I understand part of the role that we have in communicating after disasters, making sure we're putting out really accurate information, really shedding light into what the needs are, making sure that the communities that do want to respond and do want to step up have the ability to do that. And so I don't take that lightly. in the work that we do. When gray skies strike, we just totally flip the hat. And so it's driving trucks and running forklifts and pulling pallet jacks. Michelle's the pallet jack expert for sure.
She looks like it.
I learned.
She did. And I was going back and looking for some photos for another K20 project. And one that still sticks out to me in my mind every time I see it, Michelle, is you inside that truck. We had rented a truck. Now we have our own disaster truck. But our very first pop-up we ever did together after Hurricane Ida, we showed up in a parking lot. We had no bathrooms. We had no running water, electricity. We handed out supplies for felt like 6 hours straight, 5 hours straight. And then we had a box full of trash and box truck full of trash. We didn't know what to do with it. Fortunately, we made friends with a wonderful manager at Lowe's in New Orleans East who said, pull on up. You can use our dumpsters. And the two of us for like another hour just broke down boxes and threw them in this truck. And that's sort of been the path we've been on since then, is flying the airplane while we're building it. And yet we seem to do that for every disaster because they're all unique. The needs are unique. But we've put together a model, I think, that's pretty effective. And we've seen over the course of way too many disasters to count in our 8 years together at United Way that, showing up is what's important, and figuring out sort of the needs along the way is secondary. As long as we're there and folks see our presence, that's what's important to us.
So much has changed in 20 years within New Orleans, but also just more broadly, the world, how we communicate, how we connect. Extreme weather was a phrase that was not really a phrase. But climate change, it's real as it turns out. It is getting hotter. We are having more hurricanes. The tech to track this stuff has changed. How is United Way of Southeast Louisiana preparing for these worsening conditions, and United Way more globally?
Well, in order to prepare, we have to prepare our community. And so what we're doing is, right now, specifically, we have what we call preparedness workshops. And so these are workshops where we just have individuals come in and we teach them new technologies. I mean, there's websites now that getagameplan.org is a website that's a great web tool that people can use to create an evacuation plan. So they and their families can it asks you a series of questions to consider that you probably wouldn't have thought of, potentially on your own, and things that you can really plan for you and your family. I think back to Katrina too. Texting was not a thing, which is kind of crazy to think about 20 years later, right? That's how we all communicate now.
That clamshell guy.
Yeah, yes, clamshell, yes. And the BlackBerry. But so that real-time instant communication is here now. I think social media, to Kirby's point, a lot of what we tell people is trusted resources to follow. So, we've been working a lot in these workshops with the National Weather Service. And so they've been sharing who you should be following, who should you be listening to, and maybe make sure that your resources are valid and that are trustworthy, because there's a lot of information, especially media tactics in terms of that idea of scaring, unfortunately, when these disasters are coming. So who can you turn to? What type of resources are out there? So I think it's really about preparedness in the community and making sure that people understand what tools are even out there. Also, we help people just in terms of, more at the senior level. We have ways that we can teach them how to get on the computer and where do you go and how do you actually click these tools and find this information. So I think it's also, you have to consider too, to some, it may be easy to pull out a mobile phone and find certain things. But one lady at one of our preparedness workshops, we have this alert system in the city that's run by the mayor's office in the city. It's called NOLA Ready Text Alerts. And I said, do you mind if I take your phone? And I took it for her and just set it up for her. And she said, thank you so much. So I think it's even just simple things like that we're helping people understand what tools are even out there and available.
That feels just so prescient. I was reading something recently, I don't want to get this wrong, but about AI. Google is doing some like they have this flood hub, with AI. How are people going to use it? How do they learn to use that? There's an access gap. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, one of the things we actually just did is with our partners at Verizon. So a lot of corporate partners are coming into in communities as a whole saying, how can we show up? How can we help your community best? And so we formed this partnership with them. They developed this technology that's actual flood sensors that are solar powered that can detect flood waters and when they rise. Well, together through that, we implemented 50 sensors in New Orleans. So we have 50 sensors up in the community that are now detecting floodwaters. And so fast forward about a year now, we also have that now data readily available to citizens. So it's a Streetwise, which is an app here in New Orleans.
Yeah.
So now people can go on, look through this Streetwise app, determine what areas are flooded, where should they not be driving right now? Because here in New Orleans, we're a big bowl.
Yeah.
And so it floods very quickly. And so there's key areas in the city that we know that flood that we worked with them on to figure out where should these sensors be, how do we detect that, and then how do we get it to people real time. So it goes back to kind of that part that Kirby mentioned, all about real time information and data and getting it to people to hopefully save them in the end.
Is this new? This sounds very new.
Yeah. It's new. And I think the important thing to talk about is with this technology is that if we're thinking back 20 years ago with Hurricane Katrina, much of what we're talking about today would not have changed the outcomes for these families that couldn't evacuate, couldn't afford to evacuate, for whatever reason, ended up in the Dome or ended up at the convention center, ended up at like I-10 at the Causeway.
Yep.
Or wherever you may have been. But what it does do is give you some power in your hands over your own resiliency. And it's a term, right, that folks in New Orleans or in this region are tired of hearing, like, I'm tired of having to be resilient. I'm tired of having to be resilient. And this whole idea is around giving these technologies and preparing this information for you, making sure that you have it at your fingertips so that you're in control of your own resiliency. And it's just really the shift that we're trying to make. And so these hi-fi sensors, they're in areas that are known to flood. We know they flood, but if you have the power to know when they flood, you have some control over, I need to leave for work early so I can get to my job because I can't afford to miss a shift. If I miss this shift, I may not be able to buy my prescriptions next month, or I may not be able to cover rent. Or, I need to get home and move my car. It flooded 2 months ago. I better make sure I'm there to move it this time. And so it's all these little things that as we build up this preparedness muscle for individual households, individual communities, they can take charge of their own resiliency. They don't have to be left to be resilient on their own or as a community that's been left behind. And so you talk about older adults and having this gap. We're fully aware of it. We're pleased to say that a lot of folks that come into these workshops are older folks, and they're coming back to the next one and the next one and bringing more and more friends to say, hey, I brought more folks here. Okay, let's talk about this. Show me how I take pictures of the serial number on my microwave, or how would I take a video of all the belongings in my home, because now you can have those things. One of the other tips we always share with people is, right, take pictures and videos of your important documents, of the things that if you lost them, you would be able to claim them on your insurance. But also then, how do you put that in the cloud? Or how do you share that with a trusted friend or family member? And it's all those little things. Again, that's just building those little extra bits of resiliency, of preparedness into communities that, again, worst case scenario, it's not maybe going to change the outcome, but the hope is that the more and more it happens, the better prepared we can be.
So the sensors that you're talking about, that you've just rolled out 50 of them, correct me, but it just strikes me that had those sensors existed, and I know that Camp Mystic, I think in Texas, that I know there was a different situation. Like folks were literally on top of the flood zone, not unlike New Orleans in some ways. But would those sensors would they have helped? I mean, yeah.
I think potentially. I mean, you never know. I think every disaster is different, and you would hope that certain technologies would provide, that reassurance. But it would have told them where the flood bars were. The thing with that particular disaster is it happened so fast. So it would have depended on how quickly that information would have got to the individuals at the camp and other areas. So I think it's all a matter of going back to kind of technology and how quickly can we get data, real-time information to people. I think that's where we're at right now, and trying to figure out how do you do that as quickly as possible.
The other thing I think about too that's important, and we talked about, right, like trusted sources, trusted information sources. In this time when people are leery of trusting the media, it seems that there's still a general trust in meteorology and in the weather services, which is important, I should say, for a large swath of the country anyways, which is important. But the other piece of that is then good information in the flood maps and in these other places, and acknowledgement of like where it really does flood, and so that we know these things. And so I think there's some intricacies in that disaster, unfortunately, that have to come to light. But again, to Michelle's short answer, like, yes, this is a type of technology, and it's cheap. It's easily repairable. It's a PVC pipe that houses the technology. It's really something simple to implement, and we're excited that it is going into other communities thanks to this partnership.
You mentioned FEMA and the role that it's sort of an existential question. How much will FEMA, what is FEMA? How much will FEMA be involved? But again, in this heightened state of disaster, we need some emergency response. What is that doing for you guys as an organization? How do you think about the next phase of your resiliency planning, and will FEMA be around? Yeah.
Go ahead.
I
was going to say, for us, it's, the standard answers, we're controlling the controllable. So there's a lot we don't know. We have some insight that Michelle can share what we've heard on what will happen this year with FEMA. What goes on from there, we really don't know. again, what's important for us then is making sure that these families are financially secure enough to weather the storm as best they can on their own or with support of nonprofits like United Way and other partners in our community. So that means making sure you have a savings plan in place, even if it's $2 a week, $2 a month. Even if it's $50 in your bank account, in a special account, that might be a tank of gas to get you out. And we know after Katrina, folks didn't have enough money to top off a gas tank, much less if there was gas there. But those are just some small little things that we're trying to make sure folks can do so that they have some independence, again, some ownership over their resiliency, so that if FEMA doesn't give that $700 to maybe recoup the food you lost or the gas you needed or the prescriptions you lost, you've got some control and hopefully something that can get you through.
What we've been told right now is that, well, no one really knows, unfortunately. Right now, here now, we've been part of some conversations where they're doing assessments of what should it look like, what could it look like, how to potentially there's been chatter of does it move to the state level and then does the state run it and how does that look? Right now, for this particular hurricane season, we've been told that it won't change anything. That gives us a slight, glimmer of hope, if you will, that hopefully resources will still be around right now. But next year, that's not necessarily the case. And so what we understand right now is they're trying to figure out how does that look like? How do they show up? How do people respond? But to Kirby's point, because of the unknown and potentially the lack of resources that are available from that standpoint, this preparedness is more needed than ever.
It sounds like both of you are employing these very cutting edge pieces of tech. How do you think about the future? I mean, you've got these flood sensors. Like, what's next?
Yeah, I mean, this first part of my response isn't necessarily going to be tech-centric, but I worry about communities getting left behind. In my own household, we're having conversations around, does it make sense to still own a home in this part of the country, or are we better off to rent something, even though if we're not sure how long we're going to be here or we're always going to be here, we're going to retire here, but does it still make sense to have that liability as insurance prices go up? Flood insurance is a big question mark we don't know what's going on with FEMA. And trust me, we don't have those answers today. But I worry about communities getting left behind because we're seeing it already in some of the lower lying areas south of New Orleans, that these communities, not only are they being left behind, but they don't want to leave because there's so much. It's your history. It's your home. But if you can't afford to stay and you can't afford to leave, then what happens there and what role does United Way play in solving that riddle? So again, another answer we don't have. I'm concerned about that for those households because we do know the storms are going to get more severe. They're becoming more frequent. The biggest challenge that we have is donor fatigue, is disaster after disaster. They continue to happen and they get less and less coverage by the media, which means there's less attention to fundraising, which means it's harder and harder to draw those resources in, which means then we can't respond to what the needs are. That's, to me, is I think our biggest challenge and how we solve that. I don't know.
I appreciate you and your candor with that. The science is telling us that it's really hard to live in these places where the ground is literally shifting and going out to sea. And yet these are our homes, right? Do you see tech playing a role? It seems like it already is. I think about these sensors. That's information people didn't have. What does it look like in 5 years, 10 years?
I think it is playing a role right now. The sensors we mentioned earlier, but things like fortified roofs, that's a big thing here in this community. That is just new technology that's available to better harden a house, if you will, in terms of just making it sturdier, better weather prepared. So I do think tech in terms of the things being invented will help in terms of that preparedness. But I think it's interesting. I think tech will always play a role in that sense. New technologies providing people with that real-time data. But I think even 5-10 years from now, I still think at the core of it, it comes to people helping people.
Michelle, Kirby, thank you for this time, for being here today. And you've got a ton on your plate. It's, really special that you spent a little time with us. And we'll let folks know, listeners, where they can, learn more about the United Way of Southeast Louisiana and how they can help, et cetera. But thank you both. This has been great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cory.